HOA Karen beat my disabled daughter with a metal bat. I'm a detective and she's in jail. The scream didn't sound human. It sliced through the stillness of our cul-de-sac like glass shattering in a church. By the time I crossed the street, I could already see the reflection of the metal bat in the sun, raised high in Margaret's trembling hands. The HOA's self-appointed queen stood over my daughter's wheelchair, her face flushed with fury, shouting something about rules and property lines. My little girl lifted her arms, instinctively protecting herself as the bat came down again, this time hitting the chrome side of her chair with a hollow clang. Neighbors froze. A sprinkler hissed in the background. The scent of gasoline and wet grass mixed with iron in the air. I reached her just as the third swing came. My hand caught the bat mid-arc. The impact numbed my palm. For a heartbeat, we stood face to face, her eyes wide, mine silent. "You can't threaten an officer of the law," I said quietly, prying the bat from her grip. Her smirk faltered. She didn't know, not yet, that the man she'd just assaulted, the father she thought powerless, was a detective, and that from this moment on, every move she'd ever made in this neighborhood would become evidence. She had no idea justice had already started. Before that afternoon, our lives were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Mornings began with the soft hum of the coffee machine, the slow rise of sunlight over identical rooftops, and my daughter's laughter echoing down the hallway. She'd wheel herself to the porch to feed the stray cat she named Daisy, whispering stories only they understood. The air always smelled faintly of lavender from my late wife's garden, a small patch of color I'd promised to keep alive for her. Our neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, looked perfect from the outside. White fences, manicured lawns, and an HOA board obsessed with appearances. Every house matched, every hedge trimmed to a regulation height. The bylaws were thicker than most criminal case files I handled at work, and yet the residents clung to them like scripture. I worked downtown, Detective Michael Ward, Major Crimes Division. After years of homicides and corruption cases, I cherished the predictability of suburbia. The irony still stings. I thought I understood danger, that it only lurked in alleys or behind unmarked doors. Not in cul-de-sacs. Not in women who hosted bake sales and smiled for Christmas cards. Our life followed rhythm, school, hospital visits, my shift rotation, bedtime stories. I was rebuilding, patiently, deliberately. My daughter's therapy was working. She'd started drawing again, coloring the world her legs could no longer chase. For the first time since her accident, she looked happy. I used to believe evil announced itself, that it came wearing dark clothes, carrying intent in its eyes. But here it wore pastel sweaters and carried a clipboard. It called itself Community Enforcement. Back then, I didn't know the woman who signed my HOA violation notices would soon swing a bat at my child. I didn't know I'd hear that same bat echo like thunder through my garden. And I didn't know I'd end up showing this neighborhood what justice really looks like and up close. It started small, as evil often does. The first letter appeared on our doorstep one Friday morning, a crisp white envelope stamped with the HOA logo, Willow Creek Compliance Division. Inside, typed in perfect bureaucratic tone, was a notice. Violation 14B, unauthorized playground equipment on lawn area. The equipment was a tiny plastic sandbox shaped like a dinosaur, a therapy tool my daughter used for hand coordination exercises. I smiled when I read it, thinking it had to be a mistake. That evening, I found out it wasn't Margaret Bell. Margie to her friends, chairwoman to herself, walked up to my porch holding a clipboard and a posture that screamed superiority. She was the kind of woman who turned neighborliness into surveillance. Her perfume arrived before she did, something sharp and floral, too strong for the open air. "Detective Ward," she said, her voice stretched thin with politeness, "we've received multiple complaints about your daughter's toy violating community guidelines." I looked past her, at my little girl who sat in her wheelchair painting shells by the sandbox. "You mean that?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "All outdoor play items must remain within 4 feet of the patio edge. Page 12 of the HOA handbook. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I said, I'll take care of it. But before I could move it, the sandbox vanished. 2 days later, I found it behind the community dumpster, smashed. My daughter's painted shells were shattered in the gravel. That evening, she asked me, "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" I didn't answer. I just hugged her. Then the rumors began. Neighbors whispered that I was abusing HOA property. Someone vandalized our mailbox with the words, "Rules apply to you too." By the next week, Margaret was patrolling again, measuring lawn edges, snapping photos, acting as if our yard was a crime scene. She even scolded my daughter for feeding the stray cat, claiming it was unsanitary. I filed quiet notes, dates, witnesses, timings, habit. I'd been trained to see patterns in chaos. Then came that sun-bleached afternoon when the cicadas buzzed loud enough to drown thought, and Margaret finally crossed the line between obsession and violence. I was returning from a short grocery run when I heard the first scream. Across the street, my daughter's wheelchair lay tipped on its side. Margaret stood over her, a metal bat gripped tight in both hands, the kind used for garden edging. Now dripping with anger, she was shouting about rules, about violations, as if she could hammer order into a child's world. I ran. The scene blurred. Grass, sunlight, my daughter's cry, that terrible clang of metal against steel. And when I reached them, all the training, all the composure I'd built over a decade on the force, froze into one silent realization. This wasn't neighborly conflict. This was assault. And she had just declared war on the wrong man. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. Years of detective work had burned that instinct out of me. Rage never wins. It contaminates evidence. So I stayed still while the paramedics worked, their radios crackling against the hum of panic. My daughter's face was pale, her breath shallow, but she was conscious. A bruise bloomed across her arm like spilled ink. The metal bat lay in the grass beside her, glinting under the afternoon sun. Margaret stood a few feet away, trembling now that the adrenaline had left her. She muttered to the cluster of neighbors forming at the sidewalk, "It was an accident!" She came at me first. She scared me. The words sounded thin, rehearsed. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Sympathy spread faster than truth. I walked toward my daughter's wheelchair, straightened it, and placed her small blanket, the one with cartoon stars, back over her lap. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "You're safe now." She clutched my sleeve with her good hand, eyes glassy. When the first responding officer approached, I showed him my badge, though my voice stayed even. "You'll need to document everything. The weapon, the statements, the security camera on the corner house, record it all." He blinked, realizing who I was. Margaret's eyes widened. You're a cop?" "Detective," I corrected quietly. For the first time, she stepped back. The bat, her power, her HOA titles, suddenly none of it mattered. I took out my notebook, the same one I used on homicide calls, and began writing. Date, time, weapon description, witness count. No shaking hands. No raised voice. Just precision. Because in my world, silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And in that stillness, as the sirens grew closer, I decided exactly how this story would end. She'd built her little kingdom on fear. I was about to dismantle it, one fact at a time. The following days felt like living in a distorted reflection of reality. The world looked the same, but everything inside it had cracked. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, that familiar blend that seeps into your clothes. My daughter lay in her bed surrounded by monitors, one arm in a soft cast, the other clutching her stuffed cat. She didn't talk much. She just stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing invisible shapes with her eyes. The doctors said she'd heal physically. Emotionally, that was harder to measure. Every time the door opened, she flinched. That hurt more than any bruise could. Margaret was arrested that night, booked for aggravated assault on a minor. But the calm I felt was short-lived. The next morning, she was out. Bail paid by the HOA's legal fund. That's when I realized this wouldn't be a simple case of justice. It was politics. 2 board members visited me at the hospital under the guise of checking in. They brought flowers and veiled warnings. "We hope this unfortunate misunderstanding doesn't escalate, Detective," one of them said. "The HOA has procedures. Lawsuits can get messy. Messy." That was their word for what she did. A week later, a letter arrived at my home. The same HOA stationery. Same self-righteous tone. "Due to ongoing tension caused by your family, we're requesting your compliance with community decorum standards." I almost laughed. They wanted decorum. Neighbors started avoiding me. Some whispered that I'd overreacted, that the detective was throwing his weight around. Margaret, free and smug, began spinning her version. That my daughter had startled her with a sudden movement. That she'd swung out of fear. That the bat barely touched her. But I knew better. I had footage, grainy, partial, but enough to tell a story. The problem was HOA control over the neighborhood was absolute. Even police reports went through their liaison. At work, my captain suggested I let another department handle it to avoid a conflict of interest. I agreed, outwardly calm. Inside, the fire burned steady. They wanted to hide behind their bylaws and community image. Fine. I'd play by the rules. Mine. Because while Margaret tried to weaponize her status, I had something stronger: patience, law, and truth. Every villain thinks they're untouchable until the paperwork catches up. And I was about to make sure every dotted I in hers became a nail in her own coffin. People in Willow Creek thought they knew me. The quiet father who nodded at bake sales and never bothered the hedges. They didn't know the file cabinets at the Major Crimes Division where my handwriting appeared on subpoenas and affidavits. They didn't know how my world smelled of old paper and espresso, how I could read a timeline the way others read a newspaper. That's not arrogance, it's habit. Years of turning chaos into a sequence of facts teach you to see the invisible seams beneath polite facades. After the hospital, I made the necessary phone calls. Not threats, paperwork. The first was a preservation letter, formal. Mailed and emailed to every homeowner with a camera in a 2-block radius. Preserve all recorded footage between 13-0 and 16-0 on 2025-06-12. Do not overwrite. This is required for investigation MC 2025-1123. The clerk sighed when I handed her the case number, but she typed it in anyway. Institutional muscle responds to formality. We moved legally and deliberately. I signed an affidavit establishing probable cause. She'd assaulted a protected person with a blunt instrument. There was a witness, medical reports, and visible injury. That affidavit supported a subpoena duces tecum for surveillance footage from 3 residences and a condo camera covering the Greenbelt. I requested call detail records for phones in the vicinity and filed a motion for emergency preservation with the municipal court clerk. Everything had to be preserved intact with timestamps, hashes, and chain of custody documentation. I am careful about my badge when it intersects with family. Internal Affairs would not appreciate a detective shoehorning himself into his own case. So I recused my unit from the prosecution pipeline and asked the county's Special Victims Task Force to assign a different detective for charging decisions. That way my action stayed above reproach. The work I did was technical, not prosecutorial. Paperwork, evidence control, and forensics coordination. I remember the small things that become big things on paper. The garden soil under Margaret's fingernails documented in an evidence log. The bat inventoried and sealed in an evidence bag labeled X1. Chain of custody. Officer L. Ramirez, 06-12-1548. A timestamp can convict as surely as a confession. We got the hospital's imaging and notes, the attending physician's entry, contusion, wheelchair strike, minor concussion suspected. Child stable, became an objective anchor in the narrative she tried to spin. I also pulled municipal records, Margaret's HOA complaints log, previous compliance citations she'd filed against neighbors, minutes from board meetings where she'd advocated for stricter enforcement. Those minutes were public record, paper trails that showed motive, control, escalation, and a pattern. Legal teams respect patterns. There was smell in the evidence room, rubber gloves, disinfectant, and the faint metallic scent of the bat itself when I opened the sealed package under fluorescent light. I photographed everything. Macro shots of paint flecks on the bat, a grainy frame from a neighbor's camera showing her approach, the arc of her swing frozen like a bad taste. Each file was hashed and logged. If anything broke in court, it wouldn't be the chain of custody. In private, late at night, I compiled a 20-page memorandum for the prosecutor. Exhibits labeled, witness statements summarized, evidentiary links described in plain English. I cross-checked timelines, reconciled human testimony against objective footage, and outlined probable cause for aggravated assault and child endangerment. The memo closed with a simple line, recommend felony charging. Consider enhanced penalty due to disability of victim. That's how you dismantle a fortress, with small, unromantic acts of legal precision. No theatrics, no vengeance masquerading as justice, just paperwork, persistence, and a steadfast refusal to let a narrative be rewritten by money or status. When I slid the last exhibit into the binder, the overhead fluorescent hummed like a steady metronome. The work was clinical and clean. The next move was out of my hands, but I knew, down to the grain in the wood table, the moment the system would begin to bend toward truth. Justice isn't loud. It's a whisper that builds momentum. While Margaret returned to her cul-de-sac kingdom, pretending innocence, I spent nights constructing the kind of trap no one could see until it closed. I started with the evidence chain. Every copy of footage was encrypted, hashed, and duplicated off-site. I contacted an ADA friend at the district attorney's office, not to interfere, but to ensure the file wouldn't go missing. In small towns, HOA influence runs deep. Cases vanish quietly when the accused sits on the right committees. I wasn't giving them that chance. Next came witnesses. One neighbor, Mr. Patel, had recorded the aftermath on his phone. He was scared. "Detective, I don't want trouble," he said, twisting his wedding ring. I assured him this wasn't about trouble. It was about truth. When he realized the footage could protect my daughter, a child, his fear softened. Within 2 days, his statement joined the file. Then I reviewed the HOA bylaws themselves. If justice wasn't only legal, it would be poetic. Section 8.3. All HOA board members must uphold community safety and are subject to removal for conduct unbecoming or violent behavior. Perfect. That clause became my key. Using public records, I traced Margaret's pattern of harassment. 4 prior warnings issued to families with children, all dropped before escalation. I pulled the emails she sent, each dripping with control. "We cannot allow exceptions. Rules keep us civilized," she'd written once. That line would read beautifully in a courtroom. The next step was personal, a psychological portrait. Every bully hides insecurity. Margaret's came from control, a need to dominate what she feared. So I used patience against her. When the police didn't charge her immediately, she assumed she'd won. I let her bask in that illusion, all while preparing her downfall. At work, I drafted a sealed report labeled "For Prosecutorial Review Only," but its copies found their way, anonymously, to local journalists. The kind who specialized in HOA corruption stories. A few polite phone calls later, they began sniffing around. By week 3, I attended the next HOA board meeting, calm and composed. She smiled when she saw me, assuming I was there to concede. But the entire session was being recorded. By law, open session audio is public record. I asked one question, my voice steady. "Madam Chair, does the HOA condone violence by board members toward disabled residents?" The silence that followed was delicious. Her face paled. Other board members looked at one another, unsure how to answer. The camera blinked red in the corner, capturing every twitch. I left without another word. That night, Margaret sent a letter to all residents, trying to control the narrative. I smiled when I saw her mistake. She'd written it under official HOA letterhead, directly implicating the board in her defense. That's called abuse of office. The final layer of my plan was timing. Legal justice would take weeks, but social justice needed only a spark. The prosecutor's office scheduled a preliminary hearing. I made sure the HOA board received subpoenas the same day as their community barbecue. People forget, revenge doesn't require rage, just structure. A good man builds his retribution the way he builds a case, piece by piece, until the only sound left is the click of the trap shutting, and that sound was coming. The moment of reversal rarely arrives like a clap of thunder. It arrives like a small, deliberate click, a hinge turning, and then the whole door swings. I watched it happen in slow motion, as if the neighborhood itself were a camera and each resident a frame that finally focused. On the day of the HOA barbecue, the street smelled of grilled meat and cheap cologne, a false cheer stitched over tension. Children ran with paper plates. Fairy lights hung like quiet stars. Margaret moved through the crowd like a queen among courtiers, her laugh practiced, her hand dishing out platitudes about community values. She had made a public performance of her innocence and expected applause. I took my place at the edge of the gathering, a plain man with a binder under my arm. I wasn't there to shout or to accuse, just to observe, to let the machinations I'd set in motion reveal themselves. A prosecutor I trusted stood at my left, a subpoena tucked in her pocket like a card in a sleeve. Reporters milling by the notice board clicked pens and fidgeted, hungry for the crack in the veneer. When the board called the meeting to order, Margaret rose, radiant in the late afternoon sun. She spoke of lawn care, of rules, of civility. I listened. Her voice was steady, until Mr. Patel's phone chirped and the ringtone played back the grainy, heart-stopping moment we'd all replayed a dozen times. The bat's arc. The swing, my daughter's chair toppling. Conversation stuttered. The music faltered. Then Officer Ramirez, uniform pressed and solemn, stepped forward with the metal evidence bag. He didn't have to explain. The bag said it all. In it, the bat gleamed like a confession. He set it on the table and unzipped the clear plastic so everyone could see the scuff marks, the paint flecks, the smear that forensic had matched to the victim. The sound of plastic sliding open was louder than any accusation. People shifted. A woman near the food table covered her child's ears. A man who'd earlier avoided my gaze now stared at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. Margaret's jaw worked. Her smile collapsed inward. She opened her mouth and closed it again. It's difficult to maintain a performance when the props have been removed. Then came the emails, printed and distributed on legal pads. Lines of earlier complaints she'd filed, minutes where she suggested strict enforcement, the preservation letters I'd sent stamped with municipal seals. Each sheet laid another brick in a wall so thick the air in the room changed. Light dimmed as if a cloud passed over the sun. Margaret rose, tried to speak, and the room politely, then inevitably, refused to let her. Her attempts at explanation fractured into contradictions. "I was protecting the community," she said. Then, "She provoked me." And finally, a whisper, "I didn't mean—" That last word hung and evaporated. The prosecutor stood and, in measured tones, read the charges. Aggravated assault, child endangerment, abuse of office. People murmured, then stilled. A few called for her resignation on the spot. The HOA's own counsel, Face Ashen, muttered that the board would convene an emergency review. The barbecue dissolved into a legal proceeding. As officers guided Margaret away, she glanced back at me. Her eyes sought triumph and found only a quiet man with a child wrapped in a blanket watching. There was no gloating in my look, only a ledger of facts and the finality of consequence. She had expected shame to be something she could control. Instead, it controlled her. By the time the sun slid behind the maple trees, the neighborhood had changed its posture. People who once turned their heads now looked straight at me and my daughter, and some nodded with the small humility of those who had been wrong. The reversal had not been a single blow. It was a sequence of small, inevitable truths collapsing her narrative. I closed my binder then, the pages a soft rasp. The legal machinery would grind now, court dates, filings, depositions, but the social turn had already been made. For the first time since the bat hit steel, I felt a lightness settle in my chest. The gravity had shifted. The villain stage was cracking beneath her feet. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper, a scent that always meant accountability to me. The sun cut through the high windows, washing the oak benches in a clean, clinical light. Margaret sat at the defense table, her pastel jacket replaced by gray cotton. Her nails, once immaculate, were bare now, bitten down to nerves. The courtroom was half full, neighbors, board members, even the same ones who'd once brought us flowers at the hospital. They whispered, their words floating like static, waiting for the moment when appearances would finally collapse. I didn't testify first. The prosecutor started with the medical report, then the photos, then the recorded footage, each piece projected in sequence. The sound of that metal bat striking the wheelchair echoed through the room. Someone gasped. Another muttered, "My God!" Margaret stared at the screen, stone-faced, but her leg bounced under the table. Her attorney objected, claiming context, but the judge waved it off. Context doesn't erase evidence. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. "The victim," I said, glancing toward my daughter, "is my child. She was born with cerebral palsy. She doesn't have the ability to run, to defend herself, or to flee. The woman sitting there used a metal bat against her because she didn't like where her sandbox was placed." I let the silence stretch, every word hanging heavy. "People like her hide behind procedure," I continued. "Behind HOA bylaws, behind rules that sound civil but exist to control. But law, real law, exists to protect. To draw the line between order and cruelty, the prosecutor introduced the HOA emails next. One by one, each message appeared on the overhead monitor. Margaret's signature, her words about removing problems and cleaning the neighborhood. Each phrase twisted into evidence. Then came the final blow. A resident. A mother of two stood and testified that Margaret once bragged about scaring that detective's kids straight. The courtroom went still. The judge looked up over his glasses, lips pressed tight. Margaret's composure cracked. "They're lying," she snapped, voice rising, echoing. "This is a setup. He's manipulating this because he's a cop." The prosecutor turned calmly. "Detective Ward recused himself, Your Honor. Every step he took was reviewed, filed, and witnessed. This is not manipulation. This is justice." That broke her. She slumped back, eyes wide, lips trembling. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on all counts, the sound of the gavel echoed through the hall like a closing door. Margaret didn't look at me when deputies cuffed her hands. She stared down at the floor, the same spot where my daughter's paint-stained shells had once scattered. As she was led away, I saw the neighbors again, some crying, some ashamed, some silently relieved. The illusion of perfection was gone. They finally understood what had been hiding behind their trimmed hedges. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in on quiet shoes, places the truth on the table, and lets the world watch it breathe. And in that courtroom, the truth filled every corner. Margaret Bell's sentencing took place 6 weeks later, on a morning where rain streaked the courthouse glass like tears refusing to fall. The courtroom was smaller this time. No cameras, no crowd, just the ones who truly mattered. My daughter sat beside me, her small hand tucked into mine, her wheelchair polished clean, her courage somehow larger than the room itself. The judge's tone was measured, deliberate. "Ms. Bell," he said, "you weaponized authority and community trust to justify violence. You believed rules gave you power, but the law was never yours to twist. 6 years. That was the number that left his mouth. 3 for aggravated assault, 2 for child endangerment, 1 for obstruction, served consecutively." The gasp she gave was sharp, almost pitiful. Her attorney tried to argue for probation, citing her long-standing service to the community, but the judge only shook his head. A community that excuses cruelty isn't civilized. It's complicit. When the deputies led her out, I noticed the faint tremor in her step. The same woman who once marched across lawns, clipboard in hand, dictating lives, now shuffled in chains that clinked softly like wind chimes in reverse. Her power had become her prison. But justice didn't end with the sentence. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves, invoked Section 8.3, the same clause I'd used in my report. Margaret was formally stripped of her position, banned for life from any leadership role within community associations. The HOA bylaws were amended soon after to include a resident safety clause ensuring no enforcement member could confront residents alone or engage in physical contact under any circumstances. Poetic, isn't it? The system she built to control others became the reason she lost everything. A month later, I took my daughter back to the garden. The grass had grown thick, wild even. We rebuilt her little dinosaur sandbox together, this time with bright ceramic edges that caught sunlight like glass mosaics. She laughed again, the real kind that shakes her shoulders. For the first time since that day, the air didn't carry fear. It carried renewal. Neighbors began to stop by, not with pity, but with quiet respect. Some brought paintbrushes, helping her decorate the edges with stars and animals. Even the HOA board sent a formal apology letter, signed by every member except one. I framed it in my office, not out of pride, but as a reminder. Power misused always finds its way home. That night, as twilight sank behind the rooftops, I wheeled her out under the porch light. The wind smelled of rain and lilies, the scent of my late wife's garden. My daughter pointed at the sky where the clouds had parted into a sliver of gold. "Mom would have liked it, right?" she asked. I nodded. She would have loved it. Margaret had taken her freedom, but in losing it, she'd returned ours. And in the soft hush of that evening, with the sound of crickets rising and my daughter's laughter blending with the breeze, justice finally felt like peace. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood grew quieter, not from fear, but from understanding. The lawn still gleamed, the mailboxes still stood in their perfect symmetry, but something invisible had shifted. People smiled longer, waved more sincerely. And every time I pushed my daughter's wheelchair past the park, I could feel eyes soften, not with pity, but with respect. Justice doesn't erase pain. It refines it. It turns raw anger into shape, into structure, into meaning. I've spent years studying crime scenes, reconstructing motives, and teaching younger detectives that truth is never loud. It's patient. But this case taught me something my badge never could. The most powerful justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. My daughter began therapy again. Her doctor said she was showing post-traumatic progress, which is a clinical way of saying she'd started to smile again. Sometimes she asks if bad people always go to jail. I tell her not always, but sometimes the right ones do. The garden is her favorite place now. Every morning she paints a new shell, places it gently in the sandbox, and says, "For the good days." I sit beside her, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight crawl through the flowers my wife planted years ago. Life feels balanced again, not perfect, but honest. Margaret's story ended behind bars. Mine continues in peace, and every time I hear the faint clang of a distant gate closing, I think of that bat, that sound, that day, and how it became something else entirely. A promise that no act of cruelty, however small or suburban, ever truly escapes the quiet reach of justice. If someone ever hurt your child, what would you do? Shout, fight, or wait for the law to move? I chose patience. I chose proof. Because revenge fades, but justice leaves a record. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile, waves from across the street, and hides behind rules. But truth, when you hold it steady, burns through any mask. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this happened to your family? And subscribe for more true justice stories.